All right, colleagues, welcome to this, our third session in our series of faculty development sessions, presented very proudly in conjunction with the Centre for Health Sciences Education. And our thanks again to Dr. Shira Moch and colleagues within the Centre for their collaboration on this. Just to remind you up front, if I may, that this is a series of 3 different types of engagements. Firstly, the learning workshops. Secondly, the Tech Tuesdays, and thirdly, the Health Professionals Education Club. We've had one of each, including today's, looking at a specific article under the Health Professionals Education Journal Club. We introduced the series with a look at one of the symposium that was presented at the AMI conference last year in October 2020. And discussions around that with respect to the in particular focus on assessment in the times of COVID. Last week, we're pleased to have an engagement presented and facilitated by Yanis, and I was delighted to see the engagement and the involvement of our interns, our instructional design interns and ICT interns that link to the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care, for their expertise, colleagues, but also for the opportunity that have provided them to engage with us, to learn, to grow, to develop us in their own right. And then today we're going to take the topic of assessment a little bit further, with looking at, as you see, Tuesday the 16th of March today, from 1600 to 1700, could COVID-19 be our there is no alternative TINA opportunity to enhance assessment? And I'll be looking at an article that has been written by Richard Fuller and colleagues, who indeed was the presenter at the same AMI symposium that we had a look at in our first engagement on the 2nd of March. As is always going to be the case when I present, I do want to just acknowledge that COVID-19, as many in the educational space are rightly calling the COVID-19 pandemic as having a silver lining, as you will see a quote a little bit later in my presentation, that let's not put a good crisis to waste. But all of these comments need always to be prefaced with a deep respect for those who have suffered because of COVID-19, and I reiterate that this online series is set up with that true sense of humility for what this pandemic has meant to so many of our friends, of our colleagues, of our communities in South Africa and beyond. And also, we as health science educators do this with one thing in mind, and that is to educate our youth who are fortunate enough, and that we are fortunate enough to be training, who are in the Faculty of Health Sciences at WITS, and therefore this goes out to all of our young folk who are involved in our education and service. So could COVID-19 be there's no alternative TINA opportunity to enhance assessment? Richard Fuller, Victoria Jones, John Cooper, Catherine Boursiquot, and Trudy Roberts. This was published just towards the end of last year, online. I beg your pardon, the middle of last year, online, and then discussed again and presented towards the end of the year at the AMI conference. So I do want to just quickly revisit this particular framework that that we did reference in from the AMI symposium of last year. That comes out of the Royal Society of Arts, or the Appreciation of the Arts in the UK, speaking to a framework that just looks to whether we need to, or how we can make sense of a particular crisis and the response measures that are determined in it, that are determined for it, I beg your pardon, by us in the health sciences education space. Because ultimately, irrespective of the space in which we are engaging, or the discipline or the industry in which we're engaging, makes the argument in both this article and in the AMI symposia that a number of times is that often it is a question of what to end ultimately, what have we done in a transient, temporary basis that we now need to let go of? And further, what can we amplify for having worked? And what though do we need to restart with respect to our assessment in this instance, our assessment practices? Of course, it doesn't only apply to assessment, and I do want to emphasize this, that it as the article and Fuller speaks to in this article, is that it does apply to the likes of training, assessment, and indeed our learning outcomes and curricular practices as well. This is a disruption, it is a crisis that we are responding to. And in that light, I again am going to abuse my position as presenter to remind us all of the Dreaming Disruption webinar series that we have put in place and scheduled for, and got some exciting speakers for within the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care. Facilitation again of this webinar series. Last year we had the Pandemic Pangolin series, and now we're looking at Dreaming Disruption with that series beginning from the middle of March. Yanis, give us the date. Do you remember what that date is? As to when we're kicking that off? Do you remember? I can't think of it offhand.
It starts as third week of April.
Third week of April, yeah. So we've postponed it a little bit from our original thinking, but just if you could look out for that. So just this particular journal article, I do want to stress that this is not a classic research study as we might engage with a typical journal club of having a look at the research that is being provided. This is more commentary or editorial from some respected colleagues in the field of health sciences education, and they're making a number of key observations from their particular practice in health sciences education. But that being said, they make some important opening comments in the article around, within the context of health sciences education. Richard Fuller happens to be in the particular clinical discipline of linked to the neurosciences, but now has morphed into a focal role in health sciences education. And they recognize that there is this disruption that has been taking place the world over. And for me, one of the key take-home messages from this article was really that just how common some of these challenges are that we're facing, that are common the world over. Sometimes it may be stating the obvious. Clearly, clinicians who are involved in dual roles as healthcare practitioners in clinical practice, in addition to their teaching and learning roles, well, you might say, well, Richard, clearly that's the case the world over. But when you see an article of this nature and many others that really are acknowledging exactly that and acknowledging the same challenges and the same problems, I have to say, on a personal level, I find that quite comforting, and I find that is then, in a sense, because we're also close to the coalface of learning and clinical practice in many instances, we're not alone in that, and people are grappling with exactly the same issues. Not only are there the dual roles in clinical practice and teaching and learning, but that we all, as well, the world over, have had to deal with the necessity to rapidly redesign our clinical programs and courses. And they're recognizing that in many instances, the social distancing that we are required makes for many of our processes to be inefficient, not only around training and teaching and learning and the opportunities to do so, but also around the running of assessments. Your OSCE, for example, the article notes, is difficult there's really no substitute in an OSCE context, or indeed a workplace-based assessment context, for an examiner being in the presence of a examinee, a trainee, plus or minus a colleague, the simulated patient in many instances. And there's no real substitute for that in often what is called the high stakes assessments. But typically, we are concentrating, as the article focuses on in health sciences education, on the high stakes assessment. And with that, there tends therefore to be the question of whether there is any way in which we can do it slightly differently. And I think one of the take-home messages of this article is that it does provide in a negative sense, which I was slightly disappointed about. It does give us a lot of questions as opposed to answers. But then that's in a sense a selfish approach, and that yes, I want people to be raising the questions for me, because then us as a collective, we can then ask and answer those questions, and indeed develop other questions of our own. So the social distancing requirements do make for inefficiencies, and it does make for difficulties in recruiting examiners appropriately. Examiners not only for their clinical workload, but to have our simulated patients indeed as an extra human resource, again in the OSCE context to speak of that specifically, because the article does mention those a number of times. But there is a challenge in recruiting both the extra HR, should I say, for the work for the OSCE for those high stakes assessments. But then you might argue, or that there may be a tendency to say, well, can we look at the workplace-based assessment, even given that our high stakes assessments are particularly challenging to be doing as a resource-intensive exercise anyway, the article notes. But if it is a resource-intensive exercise anyway, then we're adding further complications for needing there even to be further resources for our resource for the extra socially distant measures that need to be in place. I see Dr. Rook is on the call, and she and I have grappled over this measure of how many rounds of an OSCE we have to do for there needing to be fewer numbers of students in a round, but also for there needing to be, in many instances, more socially distant supply side human resources. And therefore there's an inefficiency to it. And I'm sure many of you have encountered the same challenges. And can we just quite simply add in a greater focus on workplace-based assessments in order to A, replace the high stakes assessments, and B, potentially move our focus to a assessment for learning as opposed to assessment of learning, but also the assessment of learning, that being, as I mentioned up front, the replacement of our high stakes assessment. In which ways, the article asks us, do workplace-based assessments replace our high stakes assessments? And the issue of validity and reliability of our workplace-based assessments is actually not spoken to in great detail in the TINA article. There is no alternative article. But nevertheless, of course, it is recognized, and we have had lately a number of discussions around the issue of the validity, reliability, and feasibility of our workplace-based assessments. You will recall, and I remind you again, if I may, colleagues, of the Ottawa consensus statements that come out of not the AMI, but the Ottawa conferences that happen on a regular basis, and their consensus statements that are spoken to, again, around assessment, around technology enhanced assessment, and other particular themes that do provide us, as again is referenced in this article, with some specific frameworks by which we can assess our own practices and assess our own possibilities within what can be termed this new normal. So questions that we are asked to consider are, what decisions and factors should we consider on our approaches to assessment in reacting to this challenge of the new normal? What solutions and good practice should be shared? How can we take advantage of the maxim, never let a good crisis go to waste? And how can short-term crisis management engender opportunities for long-term improvements in assessment practice? And I come back to the framework that I mentioned up front and that we spoke to last time. End, let go, amplify, restart. Where do what we do and what you do in your context of your own assessments, where do our practices fit into each of those boxes? What do we want to end? What do we want to let go for having restarted, as it were? I beg your pardon, for having had a temporary focus on that new measure of assessment. Thirdly, what do we want to amplify? And lastly, what do we want to restart? Is the 350, 400, 450 lecture hall complete as a method of training? Is that completely dead? Or in what instances is it not? We, for ourselves, on reading this article with colleagues in my own department, we've reflected on the fact that it's indeed for that introductory lecture was an argument amongst colleagues. For that introductory lecture where you want everybody in place collectively, for us to be saying that may be the time when we still want to have everybody together in the same room. I'm talking now specifically around non-clinical engagements was the topic of our conversation as opposed to clinical. But then a colleague then raised the question, sure, but can we not then add in certain technologies into that space, such as polling individuals within that context? So there may be something of providing the clicker technology in that setting so that we can have it rather as a flipped classroom context as opposed to just the normal didactic lecture and listen. A further colleague then raised the question, yes, sir, but with due respect, why do we need to have that as a collective in-person presence? But why do we not have that in small breakaway rooms, or rather a plenary online, and then we have the option of doing breakaway rooms as a additional feature. Having persons in LT3 on the 5th floor of the Faculty of Health Sciences building, but then breaking away to 5A07, 5A08, and 5A09 across the passageway. Well, there is logistics around that and difficulties with doing it. So the articles then speaks of the importance of having a framework of rethinking the who and why of assessment, and indeed thinking the when. The what, why, who, and when are all asked with respect to this question of, do we end, do we let go, do we amplify, or do we restart? And of course, it comes back as well, as the article makes mention of the importance of this alignment between the feedback and assessment methods for one, but back to the teaching and learning activities and the learning objectives as well. And I think the where to start is a critical factor for us. That's what one of the key take-home messages that I had from this article is, that we need a place to start. Now, this article suggests that it's assessment that we're starting on. But where do we start in terms of learning from where we've come from before COVID, learning what has benefited from the silver lining of COVID itself, and where do we go to from here? Where do we actually start? So, for example, the early stage in curricula and training of programs, if we're looking at the why and the who, there may be, and indeed the when, there may be opportunities to assess differently and later. And those opportunities should be explored, because there may be no immediate impact on progression. whereas the short-term crisis response measures from developments with a longer-term potential for enhancement, those can also be a useful strategy for making sense of the change. And the article spoke to the workplace-based assessments as having recognized that the high-stakes assessments are often somewhat challenging for their inflexibility of what we're trying to achieve. The why we're assessing may well be the answer to the question why may be a high-stakes assessment. We need to having a high-stakes, might be the high-stakes assessment. Why is that we're needing to graduate a student, and there's a summative point at which we're wanting an endpoint outcome for a student to graduate as an outcome. And is there the flexibility, the article asks, around that, arguing that there may well not be the flexibility that we require, although it does speak to some potential interventions that we can make. The article speaks to an online OSCE. Now I know that I think it's in the Department of Surgery in GEMP 3 or GEMP 4, where last year where they looked to a high stakes OSCE format. They tweaked their OSCE format in a certain manner, and it wasn't as successful as they would have liked, if I can recall from our engagements. These pose interesting questions for us. But the silver bullet, and I confess that with our introduction of the doctor, this article has reminded me that the WBA is not necessarily a silver bullet. It's not necessarily the solution to all in the clinical context. The bedside WBA format may actually be more challenging to deliver due to infection prevention guidance, the use of PPE in the setting of COVID, but also quite simply because for them to be valid, for them to be reliable, you need them to be multiple. You need them to be, yes, low stakes, which is not difficult, but you need them to be multiple, and you need there to be consistent feedback each time, and you need them to have multiple stakeholders. I beg your pardon, multiple examiners. So therefore stakeholders, people involved. And to do that is the faculty development that's required around that, and the work that the energy and resources that have to be put into that is quite substantial. Doctor as an online app for those colleagues that are not familiar with it does cover some of the feasibility aspect to it, but as is always the case, when it comes to technology, it's not the technology that drives the success, it's the people using it. And this article made me reflect on whether indeed that is the case, whether we're going to be successful with that, and what needs to be done around faculty development. The case-based discussion can take place later outside of the clinical context, away from patient-facing areas, or even be conducted online. You'll excuse me, colleagues, for having taken some of these points verbatim from this article in the interest of time. So I don't claim that these are my own words. I've taken this particular slide as well from the article directly, and it's the case-based discussion that can be held, but it does take away, as I was reading the article, from the from the authentic learning, assessment, and feedback model, a case-based discussion, and that's a challenge a deficiency that one needs to be recognizing. Recording evidence and feedback for the more complex skills, e.g., leadership, handover, handoff, can be undertaken using pre-established formats with adjusted requirements that have taken the impact of clinical care into account due to COVID-19. Now, this was recognized by the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. And I noted as well, when looking at this particular reference, that they were speaking to some of the frameworks of the interprofessional competencies that have now been recognized worldwide as being, in the last 10 to 15 years, certainly has been recognized much more significantly as us needing to be assessing appropriately. Now, colleagues who are on this very call have noted to me before that interprofessional competencies are one of the the gap between how important they are as a competence and how difficult they are to measure is one of the most significant of all the competencies that involved that a health sciences graduate needs to attain. So we're a long way away from that, but that there is perhaps the opportunity for us to be focusing down on interprofessional competencies, to be trying to improve that particular vehicle. Why? Because it does allow us to be focusing on the inherent core interprofessional competencies of an individual that the literature suggests does assist with self-directed learning of the competencies that might otherwise be assessed in a more by faculty, by the very vehicles that we're speaking of that we feel responsible for. Whereas if we do focus a bit more, the literature suggests through this Royal College that we tend to get good bang for our buck if we can get that right. The interprofessional competencies, the assessment thereof, the measurement, the training thereof, and the assessment thereof. Even if numbers of the WBA episodes are reduced, this article notes, collating the evidence of learning is vital to continue to monitor student trainee development and provide support. Now, this particular comment made me think of the distinction between what we have in our setting of a year mark and what we have as colloquially understood as multiple low-stakes assessments in the clinical context that is termed workplace-based assessment. Because our year mark in many of our rotations, colleagues, is often quite limited, quite structured, 2 or 3 observed consultations, a portfolio of learning that has to be compiled perhaps, or a logbook that needs to be completed, a case presentation, and there may be some variety within that, but there is not the multiple low stakes assessments with feedback that makes up a truly appropriate, reliable a WBA. We're not looking at standardizing to a maximum across different sites, but we are looking at because we recognize that one site is different to another, and we need to take advantage of that. We need to leverage off that difference for the benefit of our students and their learning. But the fact that we have multiple different WBAs provided for by multiple different assessors, notwithstanding the challenges with that then eases out the bumps in the road on one side, in one setting, in one academic health complex. The Clarkstorp-Chapong complex, for example, can be deemed to be equivalents. There is an equivalence between that complex and the West Rand equivalent, but they're not standardized. Necessarily so, because that's difficult and unnecessary. But with COVID-19, we can make for more authentic learning with use of WBAs, but we have to recognize that there is this challenge of how do we integrate them into the workplace, and how do we integrate them into true service learning. Then there's been the multiple debates. Then this article references these e-portfolios, and we've fallen into the trap in Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care. I say trap, I must be careful of any cynicism, because we're all learning and we're growing in this curve. But we're looking at ePass, we're looking at Logbox, we're looking at lately Scorion as an e-portfolio by which to assess our students, and that's been beneficial to do so. And that has been, those are applications that are recognized and that are in practice. In many instances, universities, medical schools, health science faculties have developed their own, with the WBAs being incorporated in the e-portfolios. But there are we're grappling with how to go forward within my particular department. And it was interesting to reference this within the article as well, to read this in the article. So this assessment for learning may be the focus for us, is what I was wondering from this article. They're sort of recognizing that our high stakes assessments, well, I got a sense that the high stakes assessments need to stay the same, to a large point, because it's difficult to, if I may use the phrase, mess with them on account of the what's at stake, quite simply. But if we have assessment for learning, AFL in this case, can we play in that space a little bit for that allows learners to both take ownership of assessment and the opportunity with respect to the diversity and how the task is approached. This does make it a little bit more fun. It's a little bit more social in terms of engaging with our learners. And it's not, they talk about a soft touch in the article. I don't know if you saw that, colleagues, for reading it. They talk about a soft touch, and it does require, it's not that. It requires a deeper application of concepts and creativity from our learners if we can think out the box in a co-creation of our assessment for learning. And to be frank with you, I mean, here as I sit as a 52-year-old middle-aged white guy, am I the one that is the best place to come up with some creative, different, innovative, interesting ways to come up with ways of assessment for learning? I suggest not. Is it not the students and some of our younger faculty who themselves can be given the space to just create and to come up with some new ways of doing so? I'm thinking of our clinical associate lecturers who, in the division of clinical associates, for example, who are so innovative, who can think through and work with our students on this, by way of example. The student-generated photos, voice tags, media clips can be used as evidence of engagement with assessment, while peer or assessor commentary can be done on shared documents. These were not examples from health sciences, admittedly, but are they examples that can be applied in a different way to perhaps our basic health sciences, our science subjects that before the clinical years? To what extent did they apply to our clinical? Again, as I implied before, you need the patient, the examiner, or the assessor and the student, and that's quite a rigid space, mindful of patient safety, autonomy, of patient respect. So that's a difficult space. But in the preclinical years, is there more flexibility? So those co-creating those alternative assessments can help. Now then, another thing, just to sort of cherry pick a little bit in the interest of time, colleagues, from the article, is they do speak to the online assessments, and the online assessments is spoken to in the article of needing to be enhanced through the use of technology. And what struck me as a sort of take-home message around this is that, yes, there's been technology that has been developed quite significantly around what's the word? Well, I guess simply prevent online cheating online. And I invite you to revisit that particular part of the section in the article, because they do question and quote a number of references that really it's not necessarily a given that that cheating happens that is any more prevalent than them that we have already encountered. Now, many of you may have had different experience of this online assessment, and in truth, I do not have a lot of experience in the high stakes online assessment. The use of question mark and an enhanced version thereof and the like, and what we've been dabbling with and in different settings, but clinical associates, GEMP. But the question we must ask ourselves is to what extent is the cheating happening more so than usual, and what are the measures that we can put in place to avoid it? And my take-home message for this, from this particular part of the article, was really, well, can we accept that it's the way we need to be going, and how do we achieve it, as opposed to being in a slightly negative a space or cynical space about it from the beginning. But again, I put that to you rather than having a particular answer or solution to this. By no means do I confess to having so. So lastly, just to finish off, I just wanted to come back to this because it is around this framework that we're looking at, and what to keep, what to restart, what to end, what to let go, what to amplify, that can allow us to look to the silver lining. And the additional questions, or as by way of summary, is, now I mentioned the large examination halls. What factors do we need to consider when we restart routine assessment? Do we need to change our blueprints due to missed clinical placements? I regret that it made me think of our instances in family medicine where retrospectively there had been recognition that there may have been a missed clinical opportunity for students to learn. I think internal medicine in the GEMP program has had that experience before. And do we then need to tweak the blueprint appropriately so that we have a framework that allows us in a structured fashion to be able to recognize what tweaks need to be made, or indeed even identifying the gap? I confess that in our context, again, in family medicine and clinical associates and the like, do we do blueprints of exams to the extent that we should do with these disruptions in mind? Yes, we should be doing it to align teaching and learning, assessment, and clinical outcomes, but if we have a third wave, which we all know we're going to have, are we blueprinting now so that we have a structure so that we can then be more efficient in how we tweak and how we react retrospectively? What's the next disruption? I'm deeply mindful of the challenges we face at the moment, and highly sympathetic to the context in which we find ourselves, colleagues, around the fees must fall and access to free education. We're going to have many of these disruptions that come through. And how do we respond, or how do we prepare ourselves? The online OSCE is there that I've mentioned and put the question to you that the article speaks to. And how can we cope with an assessment future that feels like it is changing daily? And I really like the way that the assessment finished, or beg your pardon, the article finished off, because it raised these 4 issues. And for me, I really took, again, a sense of comfort from this, colleagues, from these 4 issues that they were asking, Fuller and colleagues were asking us to essentially be and believe in and adopt as part of our culture, our assessment culture, that the communication is so critical, and that speaks to the why, who, when, and how of what we're doing. And that in itself is critical for the importance of communicating, not only having the framework, but communicating the framework. And and that's with students, because I think it was raised in a recent around the internal medicine context as well, for last with our Game 4, Game 3, I beg your pardon, and us having to introduce the clinical skills that we were saying the 2 weeks at the beginning of this year for Game 4 colleagues. We had to introduce that. And I mean, I think the internal medicine colleagues did a really nice job of recognizing where the deficiencies were, where the challenges were, and coming up with a solution. If we'd communicated as a faculty or as a school systematically who, why, when, and how that had been done, who, why, when, and how who we're assessing for, why we're assessing, when we're assessing, as in the context of the
David,
program.
you know what? Let me have a good old think about this tonight, because I have a couple of ideas.
Can I, Catherine, you're off mute, sorry. And then the flexibility. Can we have agile and creative thinking? And have we involved HPCSA in this to the extent that we could? They mentioned in the article we should involve our regulators, and I'm not sure that conversation has been had to the extent that we should have for all of these changes that are happening because of COVID-19. The collegiality is the third that they closed off with one of these four, and they mentioned that the Ottawa conference, or the consensus, I beg your pardon, the consensus statement through the Ottawa conferences, they've got a great resource apparently of the, and I haven't looked at this yet, of the sharing where resources can be shared and we can draw on a lot COVID-19 related assessment resources and others. And the statements that coming out of Ottawa are key to this. And lastly, just the compassion, and is this not a great way to finish off a consideration of COVID-19 and how it's impacted on our assessment colleagues? Because really, does it not take us off, get us off the hook a little bit in these difficult times if we can have a culture that has all too long been adversarial and hierarchical, but that now can embrace a different approach to how we all work together as colleagues, as faculty, and as colleagues together, but also as your faculty and students, and there to be a way in which we are engaging on that level. And we've had some new leadership to the faculty recently, and they're bringing in a new way of doing things and engaging together, and we hope that we can build on the new to be able to incorporate some of these key 4 items that the article finished off on. Allow me to pause there, and I welcome. We've got Yanis. I'm pausing there and allowing a couple of comments or questions to be made, if I may. And I thank you all, colleagues, for listening to me. Perhaps on my high horse a little bit with some of these things. I do apologize. But Mervyn, let's hear from you, sir.
Thank you very much. Firstly, congratulations. I think this was excellent. I think it provokes us to rethink how we assess and review our colleagues and our pupils in terms of what they have achieved and what we have allowed them to achieve. But I go back to my old gripe, and I'm sorry if I sound like the broken record, but as I say to the students, repetition, repetition, repetition. How, in times of crisis, do we make up for the lack of clinical exposure that the pandemic has created for us? It's a terribly worrying thing for me that we can assess them academically and intellectually and professionally, but how do we make up for their lack of clinical experience and skill? Thank you.
Thank you, Mervyn. And And I confess, I don't think, yes, that this article necessarily provides any answers to that. It does speak to the innovations that can be happening more for me in the preclinical space and the online spaces, but in the clinical space, to be able to assess is where can we have the innovation there. And because I think we do need the innovation, though, Mervyn, I hope you agree, because I think if we just speak to the fact that if it's a problem that we have, then we need to be trying the solutions. But a tricky one. Stephen?
Yes, hi, Richard. Thanks for that presentation. And I don't have an answer for Mervyn's question at all. But what I took from this reading that I think is a discussion I've had with Giannis is around what you've got on the slide at the moment, particularly around communication. And what Giannis has suggested that we do is put together, similarly to what we discussed last week on an introductory video, but we put together short little videos where we discuss these who, why. I mean, we know who the who is, but the why and then the why now as opposed to when of the assessment, particularly kind of programmatic assessments where there's little things happening. If in our case, our students will be writing essays or group reports. And what we've done in place is have a group class consultations. But I think just going forward, it would make a lot more sense to have a little video where you describe what the purpose of this particular assessment is, how it was structured, why it's structured in the way that it is structured, and why we bringing it into the assessment at this point in time in the students' learning. So that's something I'm challenging myself to do, and hopefully I'll be able to provide some examples to the group later on. And the second thing that I really loved was the suggestion of open book group testing. I don't know whether that would, in what context that might work, but what it got me thinking about is the potential to redefine what those groups look like. And we embarking on this mini project with the clinical associates again to teach some health systems and medical humanities content in a clinical discipline. And it would be really amazing to put those students with our students to do some kind of group assessment. And I haven't thought through the logistics of all of that, but in the spirit of interprofessional education, to say, well, how do we actually take non-clinical students and clinical students who are working in the same system, put them together to address a complex issue and to innovate and be creative in that space in an open book group testing format. So that's what's at the back of my mind at the moment. This is what I would share it.
So thank you, because that's very interesting. Because first of all, you know that framework, the who, what, why, when. If we communicate around that, and you say we know who the student is, but actually, does the student know who the student is in the context of their when, perhaps, as where they are placed within their learning? In other words, we can, if we speak to who they are and get them to understand the journey that they're on, then they may understand a little bit better. And respectfully and appropriately, we should be doing this with them so that they place their particular problem and our solution potentially in its context. And I think that will help us. That's all part of communication. And as for I noted the article spoke to the group learning, the group project. I think it spoke to, did it not speak to the possibility of doing it online, which again is preclinical, most notably? Am I correct in that? I know, or were you looking at a particular? Yeah, and it did speak to that. It also used it as a vehicle for reducing the online individual cheating. But that being said, that comes back to the importance of role modeling and training on the interprofessional competencies, doesn't it? Because groups can only work together well if they are focused on leadership, if they know leadership, collaboration, teamwork, etc., roles within a group? A challenging question. Shira, welcome.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you very much. Yeah, I really commend you on your presentation this afternoon. It's given everybody so much to think about, even in a time when we're already thinking about it. So I like how they've passed it and you've put it across to us. Thank you. I wanted to comment on what Janis put in the chat and also maybe tie it up a little bit with what Stephen is saying. And that is that we definitely need to rethink what our measures of success are. Because, I mean, when Prof. Jacobson says they're not getting the actual hands-on clinical experience, was that ever what we were actually testing? Could an OSCE do that? Would we be able to tell competence in even graduating students? And isn't that competence maybe developed when they're on their own doing their own thing? And how would we judge it at that stage? So enormous number of questions associated with what your measure of success is. And then to work backwards towards all those HPCSA competencies that we say so glibly, that are important in terms of 21st century learning, the ability to make decisions and communicate and, yes, be flexible and collegiate, etc. Where do we put those in the assessment? So, Stephen, maybe one of the things to have a look at, I know I shouldn't quote theorists of the North, but there's a guy called Eric Mazur, M-A-Z-U-R, who's a physicist who actually works out of Harvard. And he has been very innovative in his view on developing assessments with classes. And he does small group assessments where students engage with the test, they speak about it, they have second opportunities, they discuss ideas with each other, and then engage again, and then reassess everybody. So it really develops a group idea of what competence actually is. In his case in physics, but I mean, it's certainly transportable. So there are lots of people doing really interesting stuff, and I think that this is a lovely opportunity for us to think about it and talk about it. So thanks very much, everyone.
Sure, I'm really grateful for those comments, because I'm thinking that in a way, what you're saying is if we are going to restart some of what we did in the past, and by Mervyn, if I may, we're recognizing that there's been a deficiency in COVID-19, and we want to get back to a place of doing the more regular clinical engagements. I know, sir, you've been the first to question even then whether before pre-COVID, were we getting that right, and you were recognizing yourself. Am I right of the deficiencies in what we've done to date and trying to always improve?
Absolutely correct.
No, exactly. So it is important that we rethink this, and we look at trying to compartmentalize a little bit this ending for good. Letting go of some things we've done in a transient way, amplifying what's worked and restarting, but none of it can be done without a deep reflection on what wasn't working, what is working, what can work in the future. Brilliant. Okay. It is 17:01, and I do want, let's keep to time if I may. Because I do want us all to keep our energy up and come back next week and going forward for some great presentations, not by myself and in the near future, but by some really excellent presenters and others who are going to share their expertise and their thoughts with us. So I do want to, let's close now, and I thank you for your participation. I really do want to just reach out as well and thank those who are not linked in with the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care. You've been especially welcome this afternoon for joining us, and we do hope that you can join us again and perhaps share with your colleagues of some the benefits, if I may say so humbly, of this collaboration, this series in collaboration with the Centre for Health Sciences Education and the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care. So, colleagues, thank you very much, and we'll see you. We'll see you next week, I do hope. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard.